a black businesswoman, returning home after a long week of meetings, steps into the airport expecting nothing more than a smooth flight. But within minutes, everything shifts. A security officer, without cause, singles her out, questioning her, pulling her aside, and searching her bags while others watch in silence. Humiliated but calm, she complies. 7 minutes later, the officer is abruptly escorted away by airport management, leaving passengers stunned. What happened next sparked a conversation that rippled far beyond the terminal. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from and if you've ever experienced or witnessed something like this. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Eleanor Price stepped onto the curb, the polished black sedan humming quietly behind her as it pulled away. The morning air, crisp and thin, carried the weight of a day not yet spoken for. She drew her coat tighter around her small frame, her fingers tugging gently at the soft wool collar. Age had granted her a kind of grace, but it had also sharpened her senses. Eleanor did not rush. At 78, she had learned the power of stillness, how it unsettled others who were always in a hurry. The entrance to the private terminal glowed with glass and brushed steel, a monument to wealth and the quiet assurances that came with it. As Eleanor approached, the glass doors parted without hesitation, but even the mechanics of luxury could not erase the undercurrent of watchfulness she felt. It wasn't new. The tension lingered like a hand pressed lightly against her back, a reminder that she was stepping into a world where people rarely saw her as someone who belonged. Inside, the air was scented with leather and faint traces of perfume that whispered of places far from here. A marble floor stretched wide, its reflective surface offering Eleanor's careful reflection back to her. There she was, silver hair smoothed into curls, eyes dark and steady, lips pressed with the faint memory of red lipstick. She carried herself the way her mother once had, shoulders square, spine straight, as if the world could break against her but never through her. The attendant behind the counter was young, sharp-featured, and brisk in her efficiency. She wore her uniform like armor, every button gleaming, every hair pinned in place. As Eleanor approached, the young woman's eyes flicked over her briefly before settling back on the screen in front of her. The look was quick, nothing more than a glance, but Eleanor caught it all the same. "Good morning," Eleanor said, her voice smooth. She had always believed in meeting coldness with warmth. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" "I'm Eleanor Price. I'm here for the flight to New Orleans." The attendant's fingers danced over the keyboard, the screen throwing pale light across her cheekbones. Her eyes narrowed slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if the machine in front of her could not possibly be right. "I see the reservation," the attendant said finally, though her voice carried the slightest edge of doubt. "One moment, please." Eleanor waited. She knew the choreography of this dance. The attendant did not call security or ask any further questions, but there was a subtle weight in the silence that followed a sliver of hesitation before the woman spoke again. "I'll escort you to the gate," she said, her smile returning, but Eleanor recognized the shift. They walked together down a long corridor lined with photographs of jets and corporate milestones. The terminal was quiet at this hour, with only a handful of travelers scattered in the lounges. Some met Eleanor's gaze, others flicked their eyes away as if looking too long might break an unspoken rule. At Gate 9, the jet waited, its pristine exterior gleaming in the morning light. Nathaniel's company logo was emblazoned on the tail, P&L Logistics. An empire built from the ground up. Eleanor remembered the day her son bought this plane. He had called her that evening, his voice filled with the kind of pride that only comes from knowing how far you've climbed. The captain stood near the stairs, speaking in hushed tones to a flight attendant. He was tall, severe, and held himself with the kind of authority that did not invite interruption. As Eleanor and the attendant approached, his gaze shifted. His eyes swept over Eleanor, first her coat, then her shoes, then the single piece of luggage trailing behind her. "This is Mrs. Price," the attendant said, gesturing toward Eleanor. "She's boarding for the New Orleans flight." The captain's expression did not change, but Eleanor caught the slight furrowing of his brow. "This is a private charter," he said, the words clipped. "I know," Eleanor replied, her tone measured. The captain hesitated. "Do you have a boarding pass?" Eleanor allowed herself the briefest pause before answering. "I do," she said, retrieving her phone and holding it out to the flight attendant. The attendant scanned the reservation quickly. "It's all in order, Captain. Mrs. Price is confirmed for this flight." The captain stepped aside, but Eleanor saw it clearly, the momentary crack in his demeanor. The uncertainty that had not been there before. "Welcome aboard," he said, but the words felt like something forced through tight teeth. As Eleanor ascended the steps to the jet, she felt the captain's gaze linger on her back. That gaze was familiar. It was the gaze of teachers who believed she couldn't learn. Bank tellers who assumed her checks might bounce. Neighbors who saw her presence as temporary. It was a gaze that whispered, "Are you sure you're supposed to be here?" Inside, Eleanor settled into the leather seat by the window, her hands folding in her lap. The jet hummed softly, ready for flight, yet the weight of that gaze clung to her, as if the captain's doubt had left a stain on the air. From the front of the cabin, she heard the faint murmur of voices. One was the captain's, low and curt. The other was softer, but no less distinct. "She doesn't look like she should be here," someone whispered. Eleanor's gaze remained on the clouds gathering just beyond the window. The flight had not even begun, but the journey was already familiar. Eleanor Price settled into the seat, the leather cool beneath her palms. The hum of the jet was steady, a low vibration that should have lulled her into comfort. Yet, comfort was elusive when you knew you were being watched, not overtly, but with the careful precision of those who believed they hid it well. The captain's voice carried from the front of the cabin. He wasn't whispering, not quite, but his words hung low, just below the threshold of courtesy. "She said her son owns this jet?" "She did," another voice replied, one of the attendants. Likely the one who scanned her phone earlier. The captain's laugh was brief, but it cut through the cabin like the edge of a blade smoothed down just enough to slip between the ribs. "Well, stranger things have happened." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. She counted the seconds, listening to the ticking of her wristwatch. The feeling was old, familiar in a way she wished it wasn't. This wasn't her first confrontation with doubt disguised as professionalism. No, it was as much a part of her life as the creak in her knees or the silver that framed her face. But it was never the confrontation that cut deepest, it was the politeness of it all. The attendant reappeared moments later, her face carefully neutral, but Eleanor could see the trace of unease in the tightness around her mouth. "Can I get you anything to drink, Mrs. Price?" Eleanor lifted her eyes, holding the woman's gaze a little longer than necessary. She wanted to see if the attendant would flinch, if she'd look away. "Just water," Eleanor said finally. "Yes, ma'am." The attendant disappeared, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts. Outside the window, the tarmac stretched endlessly, painted in neat lines and shimmering under the early sun. There was something about airports, something almost mythic. They were places where people left and returned, where lives were paused between arrivals and departures. Yet for all their symbolism, airports still managed to become mirrors. And Eleanor knew exactly what kind of reflection she cast in the eyes of people like the captain. She was not supposed to fit this setting. Wealth had its own silent language, and Eleanor had learned to speak it fluently. Though few believed it, the cost of moving through the world as a black woman of means was to always carry the burden of proof. The attendant returned with a glass of water on a napkin so pristine it looked ceremonial. Eleanor accepted it with a quiet nod. From the cockpit, the captain emerged. He moved down the aisle with the certainty of a man who believed he commanded every space he entered. Stopping just before Eleanor's seat, he offered a tight-lipped smile. "Mrs. Price," he began, "I just wanted to make sure everything is in order for your flight." Eleanor met his gaze with the ease of someone who had long since grown tired of pretending. "It is," she replied, setting the glass down gently on the table beside her. The captain shifted, as if waiting for something, an opening, perhaps, to assert the authority he felt slipping through his grasp. "Is this your first time flying with us?" Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No," she said, letting the word linger. "I've flown on this jet many times before." There it was, the slightest flicker in his eyes. "I see," the captain said, his voice betraying none of the disquiet that rippled beneath his words. "Well, if you need anything, feel free to let the crew know." "I will," Eleanor replied, already turning her attention back to the window. The captain lingered a second too long before finally retreating to the front of the plane. As the door to the cockpit clicked shut, Eleanor sat quietly, the weight of the exchange settling over her like an old coat she had worn too many winters in a row. There was nothing overt, no raised voices, no accusations, just a series of polite inquiries, framed with care and dressed in professionalism. And yet, Eleanor felt it all the same. The questions had not been about logistics or comfort. They had been about belonging. Her belonging. Eleanor sipped her water slowly, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. The flight hadn't even begun, but the challenge had already been issued. The jet sat still on the tarmac, though Eleanor could feel the engines stir beneath her feet, a faint pulse, waiting for permission to rise. The silence in the cabin wasn't total. It was the kind of silence that hummed with things left unsaid, hanging in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Eleanor traced the rim of the glass with her finger, the condensation leaving small trails beneath her touch. From the corner of her eye, she could see the two attendants whispering near the galley. They weren't loud, but they weren't careful either. She doesn't seem like the type. Does she? Eleanor let the words drift by her, unacknowledged but not unheard. She had long since stopped being surprised by these moments. They were as inevitable as the weather. A pause, a second glance, a conversation just out of reach but not out of earshot. The truth was, people often believed the smallness of their doubt rendered it invisible, as if subtlety made it less real. Eleanor had been navigating these subtleties her entire life. The polite refusals, the lowered voices, the way someone smiled tightened when she handed over her credit card. The murmured comments that weren't quite accusations but lingered close enough to bruise. The attendant, one of the younger ones, barely out of her 20s, drifted toward Eleanor's seat with the kind of practiced reluctance Eleanor recognized well. "Ma'am," the attendant began, her voice wrapped in silk but thin around the edges. "I just wanted to double check. Are you sure this is the correct flight? Sometimes reservations can get mixed up." Eleanor set the glass down with care, folding her hands gently in her lap. She tilted her head slightly, giving the young woman her full attention. "I'm quite sure," Eleanor said softly, but there was steel beneath the calm. The attendant shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly waiting for Eleanor to offer some proof beyond her presence. When Eleanor remained silent, the woman hesitated, offering an uncertain smile before retreating. As the attendant returned to the galley, Eleanor heard her whisper to her colleague once more, "She's probably someone's housekeeper." Eleanor's grip tightened over the armrest, but she released it almost immediately, forcing her breath to steady. Let it be. But letting it be was exhausting. It required a patience that never seemed to deplete, even when Eleanor wished it would. Outside the window, the captain was speaking with ground staff. His posture was firm, his gestures short and direct. He had that air about him, the kind of confidence that often passed for competence. And yet, Eleanor saw the way his eyes flicked toward the jet, toward her. She remembered men like him from the days of waiting tables in her youth. Men who spoke to her in clipped sentences, who never met her gaze unless they were asking for something. Men who believed respect was something they could withhold until you earned it over and over again. The cabin door opened suddenly, and the captain stepped inside, striding directly to Eleanor's seat. "Mrs. Price," he said, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're almost ready for departure. But there's been a minor issue with the manifest." Eleanor held his gaze. What kind of issue? He cleared his throat lightly, as if what he was about to say shouldn't matter. "Your name wasn't originally listed in the flight's passenger records. I just need to confirm." Eleanor interrupted him with a raised hand. "Captain," she said evenly, "I've been flying on this jet for the past 2 years. The records you're looking at were prepared by your employer, my son." The captain hesitated for just a beat too long. "Of course," he replied quickly, his smile thin as paper. "I apologize for the confusion. I just wanted to make sure everything was in order." Eleanor nodded slowly, but she did not return his smile. Confusion, she thought. It was always confusion. The kind of confusion that required more from her than anyone else. As the captain retreated to the cockpit, Eleanor leaned back in her seat. The hum of the engines grew louder now, vibrating beneath her feet with a quiet insistence. She let her gaze drift toward the window again. The sky stretched endlessly above, soft and pale blue at the edges. There was something comforting about it, as if the world beyond the jet could exist unbothered by the smallness of the moment unfolding inside. But Eleanor knew better. The world was made up of these small moments, each one compounding, layer upon layer, until the weight became too much to carry. The jet lifted smoothly from the runway, but the air inside the cabin was heavier than the sky beyond the window. Eleanor Price felt it pressing down, not the kind of weight that could be measured, but the kind that sat in the chest, quiet and persistent. The world outside grew smaller beneath her, the lights of the airport shrinking into pinpricks before fading altogether. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, but rest did not come. There was no real comfort in knowing the hardest part of the flight was still ahead. And it had nothing to do with altitude. She reopened her eyes just in time to see the captain reappear. His steps were deliberate, each one loud against the carpeted floor. Eleanor remained still as he approached, though she could already hear the shape of his words before he spoke. "Mrs. Price," he began, his tone dipped in false politeness. "I apologize for bothering you again, but I've been trying to verify the manifest with our main office. There seems to be some discrepancy regarding your reservation." Eleanor looked at him calmly, though the fire that stirred in her chest was harder to contain this time. "What kind of discrepancy?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The captain hesitated, shifting his weight slightly. "It's just that we weren't informed of any additional passengers. This flight was listed as private." Eleanor folded her hands carefully, resting them over her knee. Her eyes met his directly, steady and unwavering. "Captain," she said softly, "I am aware that this flight is private. I arranged it." The captain's mouth tightened at the edges, as if her calm only made him more uncomfortable. "I don't mean to imply anything, Mrs. Price," he said quickly. Yes, you do," Eleanor interrupted, her voice even but sharp enough to cut through his excuse. The captain froze, clearly startled by the bluntness. "You do mean to imply something," Eleanor continued, "because if you didn't, we wouldn't be having this conversation. This would not be the third time you've come to my seat to ask questions you already know the answers to." The captain's lips parted slightly, but no words followed. "I assume you've spoken to my son by now?" Eleanor asked. He hesitated again. "I left a message with his office." Eleanor allowed herself the faintest smile, though it held no warmth. "He will call you back. And when he does, I imagine this conversation will seem unnecessary." The captain nodded stiffly. "I'm sure it will." But Eleanor knew better. He was not sure at all. Doubt is a powerful thing. It had a way of sinking into the cracks of a man's mind, turning small suspicions into large shadows. Eleanor had lived long enough to know that no amount of elegance, wealth, or education could erase the doubt that followed women like her. It lingered in the corners of rooms, trailing behind like smoke long after the fire had been extinguished. As the captain retreated, Eleanor's gaze drifted back toward the window. The clouds stretched endlessly, soft and untouchable, but the reflection staring back at her was sharp, too familiar. She could hear her mother's voice echoing in her memory, words spoken years ago in a kitchen thick with summer heat. "It doesn't matter how fine your clothes are, baby. They'll always look twice. Always." Her mother had been right. They always did. Eleanor leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes once more. She could feel the moment gathering. Something was coming. She didn't know when, but it would arrive. It always did. Eleanor Price was not a woman prone to theatrics. She believed in the weight of quiet things, silence, stillness, the kind of calm that made men like the captain shift uncomfortably in their polished shoes. But silence, Eleanor knew, was not the absence of sound. It was its own language, and she was fluent in it. The plane had reached cruising altitude, yet the tension inside the cabin had not leveled out. It hung beneath the polite veneer of luxury like a wire pulled too tight. The attendants moved with calculated grace, but Eleanor saw the way their eyes darted, how their smiles didn't quite reach the corners of their mouths when they passed her row. She wondered if they thought she didn't notice. It wasn't malice, not exactly. It was something softer, more insidious, the kind of thing people called just doing their job, as if professionalism required doubt. A few minutes later, the younger attendant reappeared, this time with a tray in hand. The delicate clink of glass and ice broke the stillness as she placed it on the table before Eleanor. "I thought you might like some refreshment," the woman said, offering a smile Eleanor didn't trust. Eleanor let her eyes rest on the glass for a long moment before looking up. "I didn't ask for this." The attendant's smile faltered, but only for a second. "Oh, no trouble at all. It's complimentary." Complimentary. Eleanor tasted the word like something bitter. Is that what the captain told you? She asked gently. The question caught the young woman off guard. For the briefest second, there was something unguarded in her face, a flicker of guilt or embarrassment. Perhaps both. No, ma'am, she said, recovering quickly. I just thought it might be nice. Eleanor nodded, but she didn't touch the glass. Thank you, she said, though they both knew it wasn't gratitude she was offering. The attendant lingered a moment too long before excusing herself, heels clicking softly as she returned to the galley. Eleanor watched her go, folding her hands neatly over her lap. Politeness, she thought, is a mask people wear when they want to keep their distance. It was the same in restaurants where she sat alone at tables set for two. The waiter checking in just enough to appear attentive but not enough to invite conversation. It was the same at department stores where the saleswoman trailed her at a respectable distance, near enough to watch, far enough to pretend it wasn't personal. And now, it was the same at 30,000 feet. Eleanor reached into her handbag, retrieving a slim book she had brought for the flight. She turned the pages slowly, though her eyes skimmed over the words without reading them. From the front of the plane, the captain's voice filtered through the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're anticipating some turbulence as we pass over this next stretch, so please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The words were calm, practiced. Eleanor doubted the turbulence would be significant. It rarely was, but she recognized this as part of the choreography, the captain asserting himself, subtly reminding everyone who was in control. Eleanor fastened her seatbelt and set the book aside. The ice in the untouched glass had begun to melt, water pooling around the base. Outside the window, clouds gathered in soft waves. Eleanor let her gaze drift past them, but her thoughts remained firmly inside the cabin. She wondered how much longer it would take for the phone to ring. It always did. Nathaniel would call. He always called. And when he did, the balance of power would shift just enough to make the captain uncomfortable but not enough to erase the moment altogether. Because that's how these things worked. The apology would come wrapped in smiles, layered beneath explanations that meant nothing at all. Eleanor had seen it too many times to believe otherwise. But for now, she waited, the hum of the engines filling the silence that hung between herself and the rest of the cabin. A silence that said everything they were too polite to speak aloud. The turbulence never came. The jet sailed smoothly through the sky. But the captain's warning had done its job. It had fastened more than seatbelts. It had fastened the air, tightened the space between Eleanor Price and the crew, locking them all into a silence that felt increasingly fragile. Eleanor had learned long ago that silence is not peace. Silence is often the loudest room one can stand in. It carries weight, the echo of things people refuse to say out loud, the shape of prejudice dressed as caution, the cold fact that distance is not always measured in miles. She traced the edge of the glass on the tray table. The water, now fully melted, had softened the ice to ghosts. It was a small thing, but small things had a way of piling up until they were undeniable. From the corner of her eye, she saw the younger attendant whisper to the older one. They shared a glance that skated over Eleanor's shoulder and then quickly away, as if holding it too long might invite confrontation. Let it go. That thought rose naturally, as it always did in these moments. Let it go, because it was easier. Let it go, because rising to meet it only hardened the lines of their assumptions. Let it go, because she was tired. But letting it go was costly. It had cost her the ability to move freely in spaces she had earned her way into. It had cost her comfort at restaurants, in lobbies, in stores that sold things she could afford but were hesitant to place in her hands. It had cost her time spent explaining herself, time spent proving what should never have needed proof. And now, even here, among clouds and leather seats and glasses she hadn't asked for, it cost her again. The older attendant approached this time, her steps quieter but more deliberate. Mrs. Price, she said with the kind of careful tone reserved for difficult conversations. I hope you don't mind me asking, but how did you come to know Mr. Price? Eleanor's eyes lifted from the water glass to meet the woman's gaze. Slow and unblinking. He's my son, Eleanor said plainly, offering no further explanation. The woman blinked just once, but long enough for Eleanor to see it. Oh, the attendant said softly. I didn't realize. Eleanor nodded. I suspected you didn't. The attendant smiled, but it was thin. Well, that's wonderful. Mr. Price is. I know who he is. Eleanor interrupted, not unkindly. I raised him. The attendant's face colored slightly. She stepped back, clasping her hands together, unsure of whether to apologize or excuse herself. But Eleanor didn't give her the out. She let the silence sit, made the woman feel it the way Eleanor had been feeling it since she stepped onto this plane. I'll let the captain know, the attendant said at last, her voice quiet as she turned away. Eleanor exhaled, long and slow, but there was no relief in it. She had not meant to embarrass the woman. But sometimes silence wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to lay the weight down, let it sit between you and the world, and refuse to carry it alone. Eleanor leaned back into the seat. Nathaniel would call soon. She could feel it like sensing rain in the air before the first drop falls. And when he did, the captain's demeanor would shift. Apologies would arrive, carefully worded and insistent that no harm had been meant. But harm rarely announces itself. It comes in small moments like this. Moments that ask for nothing more than the right to exist without question. Eleanor looked out at the clouds stretching endlessly across the sky. She thought of her mother, who had not lived long enough to see luxury like this. And she thought of her granddaughter, who had yet to learn the full cost of walking through the world in a body that others felt entitled to doubt. Maybe by the time her granddaughter flew on jets like this, things would be different. Maybe not. But Eleanor would not let this moment pass quietly. Not this time. The call came sooner than Eleanor expected. She heard the soft chime of the cockpit phone, the quick shuffle of steps. The captain's voice lowered but not low enough. The conversation was brief. She imagined Nathaniel's words were measured, but not gentle. Her son had inherited her patience, but not her restraint. Eleanor let the moment stretch, waiting for the inevitable. When the captain emerged, his steps were lighter now, but careful like a man descending unfamiliar stairs in the dark. His uniform was crisp, but there was something in the way he smoothed his sleeves that told Eleanor the call had unsettled him. He stopped just beside her row, folding his hands in front of him like a boy rehearsing an apology to his teacher. Mrs. Price, he began, and already she could hear the edges of it where his pride warred with politeness, where his authority buckled under the weight of being wrong. I just spoke with Mr. Price. He confirmed everything, of course. And I wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. Misunderstanding. That word again. The great bomb of men who could not bring themselves to say prejudice. Eleanor looked at him evenly. She had been given this speech in so many forms over the years that she could recite it from memory. The particulars changed, but the script remained the same. It wasn't personal. There was confusion. You understand how it is. But she wondered if the captain did understand how it was. How it felt to walk into a room and be assumed out of place before speaking a word. How it felt to explain, again and again, why you belonged there. How exhausting that became. She didn't think he did. Thank you for the apology, Captain, Eleanor said, her voice calm but without warmth. The captain nodded, relieved by her grace. He made the mistake of turning to leave too quickly, as if the matter was settled. Captain, Eleanor said, stopping him mid-step. He turned back, his smile polite but uneasy. Yes, Mrs. Price? Tell me, she said. If Nathaniel hadn't answered that call, what would you have done? The question held steady between them. The captain blinked, caught off guard. His mouth opened slightly, as if an answer might rise to the surface. But none came. Eleanor let the silence fill the space he could not. You see, she continued, I've been answering questions like yours for decades. I know how they sound. And I know how often they're asked when no one picks up the phone to explain who I am. The captain shifted his weight, searching for the right words. But Eleanor wasn't looking for them. You don't have to answer, she said softly, but I want you to think about it. Because the next woman who boards this jet might not have a son you recognize. The captain's eyes lowered slightly. And for a moment, Eleanor thought she saw something genuine flicker across his face. Embarrassment, perhaps, or maybe shame. Of course, he said finally, voice subdued. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Eleanor nodded, satisfied, but not soothed. She didn't believe it wouldn't happen again, not really. Because it always did. But maybe the next time. The hesitation would linger long enough for the man to question himself instead of questioning the woman standing in front of him. The captain returned to the cockpit, and Eleanor leaned back into her seat, watching the clouds roll by. There was no satisfaction in these moments. No victory. Just the quiet hope that she had shifted something just enough. The jet cut through the sky, smooth as glass, but Eleanor Price felt the weight of the ground beneath her still. The captain's apology had left the air quieter, but not lighter. Apologies often did that, they filled space without lifting burdens. Eleanor had carried such burdens for so long that she no longer expected them to shift easily. She watched the clouds blur past the window, her reflection faint in the glass. The older she grew, the more she understood that change was rarely loud. It didn't come with grand declarations or broken shackles. It arrived in moments like this, quiet, slow, but insistent. Eleanor's thoughts drifted to Nathaniel, to the sound of his voice on the phone. His anger had been palpable even through the cabin walls. He hadn't raised his voice, Nathaniel never did, but there had been steel in his words. The kind that left no room for misinterpretation. She remembered when Nathaniel was a boy, sitting at the kitchen table, watching her as she navigated the small indignities that crept into daily life. The store clerks who ignored her until she spoke. The teachers who assumed too little of him until Eleanor arrived at the school. Standing firm in the doorway until they understood exactly whose child they were teaching. She remembered the first time Nathaniel saw her stop herself from speaking, how he frowned. Confused, when she swallowed words that might have sharpened the air too much. "You let them get away with it," he had said once. Barely 10 years old, Eleanor had smiled, smoothing his hair gently. "Sometimes," she replied, "that's not the fight worth having." But Nathaniel had not inherited that instinct to step aside. Now, as the engines hummed beneath her, Eleanor wondered if she had been wrong all those years. Maybe silence had been too expensive a lesson. The older flight attendant reappeared beside her seat, her posture stiff but composed. She offered Eleanor another glass of water, her eyes carefully lowered. "Is there anything else I can do for you, Mrs. Price?" the woman asked. The words measured and precise. Eleanor studied her for a moment before shaking her head. "No, thank you," she replied softly. The attendant lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if waiting for something for Eleanor to say more, or to offer the kind of warmth that could absolve her discomfort. But Eleanor offered no such thing. As the woman retreated, Eleanor returned to the clouds. The truth was, even now, she was not angry. Anger was too simple, too fleeting. What she felt was older, heavier, a weariness that sat deep in the bones. It wasn't the flight that weighed on her. It was the knowing that even at this height, she could not escape the ground she had spent her life walking. Knowing that no amount of money, status, or elegance would prevent the world from questioning why she occupied this space. But Eleanor also knew something else, something even the captain's doubt could not take from her. She knew who she was. And she would not shrink beneath the gaze of men who mistook her presence for accident. As the jet began its descent, Eleanor sat straighter, folding her hands over the armrest. The sky outside softened, giving way to the earth below, and she welcomed it. By the time they landed, the captain's voice broke over the intercom, polite and professional, as if nothing had happened at all. But Eleanor smiled to herself. Something had happened, and whether the captain knew it or not, he would carry this moment with him just as Eleanor carried hers. The weight, she had learned, was not hers alone to bear.